All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our third installment of the Tennessee Department of Health's Health Equity Series. This series is a partnership between the Office of Primary Prevention and the Office of Minority Health and Health Disparities. If you're interested, you can register for our other upcoming webinars in this series on our website. We will share that link with all of our attendees after the talk today. This webinar will be recorded and available to watch on our website as well. So my name is John Vick. I'm with the Tennessee Department of Health's Office of Primary Prevention. And I wanted to also thank Matt Coleman, who's behind the scenes today. He's handling all of our technology. Matt is also going to monitor the chat during our conversation this afternoon. So please feel free at any point today to put your questions or thoughts in the chat. We have lots of time today reserved for Q&A, and so Matt will field your questions and we'll make sure that we get to as many of those as we can. So we have three outstanding panelists joining us today to talk about the topic of land use and equity. And I'll let them tell you a little bit more about their work shortly, but I'll go ahead and introduce them now. So our first panelist today is Dr. Lewis Woods. He's an associate professor of history and the Africana Studies Program Director at MTSU. Next, we have Mike Thompson, who is an urban planner with Bolton and Menk in Minneapolis, and a former Commissioner's Fellow here at the Tennessee Department of Health. And then finally, we have Gary Gaston. Gary's the CEO of the Civic Design Center here in Nashville, and also an associate professor of practice at the University of Tennessee Knoxville College of Architecture and Design. So we'll hear from our panelists in just a moment, but I did want to talk a little bit about the concept of land use. So that's our topic for today. Some of you may be more familiar with the term land use than others. So I just wanted to take a moment to define that. Essentially, it's the ways that we use our land economically, socially, and culturally. It includes things like housing, retail, office space, factories, parks and green space, farmland, and even our roadways. So land use is really how we're using all of the land that we have. An important point to note about land use is that it does not happen by accident. It's shaped by plans and policies. And those policies can determine how tall buildings can be, whether you can build an apartment building or single family homes, whether you have to have parking, how close the buildings are to the street, how wide the streets are, and whether they have sidewalks and bike lanes. And then when we look at land use through an equity lens, we think about who participates in the decision making about land use. And whether the uses were intended to be inclusive of all people or exclude certain people. So keeping that in mind, I would like to now turn it over to Dr. Lewis Woods. So Dr. Woods, can you tell us a little bit about your area of research?
Yeah, thanks again for for having me, and it's exciting to be here. I've done a lot of research on redlining, on Federal Housing Administration, mortgage lending policies, on Veterans Administration mortgage policies as well. And one of the things I think that you find pretty quickly when you look at some of these older documents from the 1930s, even up until about the 1960s, in that time frame, they were unapologetic about who they wanted in communities. Most of the federal agencies, frankly, defined people of color. FHA defined them as adverse influences. The Homeowner Loan Corporation, famous for redlining, defined them as hazardous bank investments. It wasn't only people of color, of African ancestors, people of color broadly. But one of the things that my research has focused on a little bit is looking at some of the implications generationally of these housing policies. And for instance, my grandfather was a World War II veteran, and it took him 21 years to buy a home after World War II because of some of these broader inequitable policies. And one of the things that struck me about my grandfather's experience, and one of the things that still makes me interested in doing research, was I asked the question, was my grandfather an anomaly or was he normative? Was his experience something that more African-American veterans went through? And the more I started asking that question, the more it took me down research rabbit holes, which I think are still pretty fascinating to this day. And frankly, my granddad's story was more normative. According to Veterans Administration documents, their annual report, during the World War II GI Bill, the VA lent between 1944 and 1955 just shy of 4 million homes, guaranteed mortgages on 4 million homes. They estimated that less than 30,000 of that 3.9 million and high change went to people of African ancestry, which is about 0.7%. And the FHA rate was comparable, less than 2%. And so, the reality is that when we think about home ownership, it constructs the middle class as we know it. It's, for most Americans, it is the equity in your home is the largest part of your wealth portfolio. And who had access to access to the housing is just dramatic in terms of the documents. So real estate agencies were discriminatory, individual homeowners with racially restrictive covenants were, and then federal agencies defined communities of color as negative investments, and also talked about ways to keep people of color out, really, in their documents. I'm thinking about the underwriting manual from the FHA, for instance, or the redlining maps defining folks as hazardous. They even had an infiltration section for certain communities, right? Had a Negro section, infiltration section, and a section for foreign born, all of which were perceived to be negative indicators for particular homes and particular neighborhoods. And so, yeah, I mean, that's in a nutshell. The more I study the policies historically, the more I'm shocked, frankly, at the continuity in terms of generational implications from those earlier policies, where people, the huge gaps in home ownership among race, huge gaps in achievement, where public schools typically funnel into from the neighborhoods, you kind of funnel into the public schools, interactions, as y'all know, better than most. The implications for health inequities based on where you live. And so to me, zip code is destiny, impact on police encounters. And unfortunately for so many, these policies were written in an unapologetic way. I joke with my family and say, if we wanted to take folks to court, press charges about this, there's enough evidence in those documents to indict folks at a legal. I mean, they're unapologetic. And the more you read those languages, when I show and present, images of some of these documents, you can almost see people clutching their pearls because the language is so so unapologetic. And frankly, I think that today we tend to we associate home ownership, with individual and the like, but the reality is, in 30% of Americans were homeowners. And once the FHA is established in 1934, the VA, with the GI Bill, by 1960, the number of Americans who are homeowners is more than double, 62%. And so it's not because individuals just all of a sudden started saving their money. It's because these policies made home ownership affordable for millions of people, which was a good thing for the country. But while they were letting millions and millions of Americans have access to home ownership and wealth construction, they were keeping entire communities on the sidelines, essentially. And so that's probably a good place to pause. So the rest of the panelists have a go at this, and so that we can make sure that we have enough time for questions.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Woods. Yeah, so let's go to Mike Thompson. Mike, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in Minneapolis.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John, and appreciate everyone the chance to be on here, and especially to reconnect with friends and colleagues back from Tennessee. It's good to see y'all. As John alluded to, a history with working with the Tennessee Department of Health and actually the Nashville Civic Design Center as well. And I moved back home actually up to Minneapolis, where I am now, about 2 years ago or so. And it's been, an interesting time to be up here in particular, and this kind of gets back to this land use, especially, COVID, like we've all had to kind of re-understand our relationship to space and to land and how we use those. But particularly for those who have followed the ever-present news with the murder of George Floyd, subsequent kind of protests and depending on who you ask, uprising, and I use that phrase on purpose for many people, kind of their perspective, and how, again, this has reshaped our understanding of land, how it's used, who it's owned, and for me, kind of what brought me into this process and kind of the profession of being an urban planner is the intersection of identity and space and land and all that, and how we understand ourselves, the world around us, and others based on our understanding of land and the history of it too. So I mentioned, George Floyd, and for those who follow, George Floyd Square, which is an intersection, the intersection where he was murdered, about a block or so in each direction, that has kind of been, taken over to some degree or reclaimed, again, depending on who you ask, and the uses there around it kind of by the community, and the complications that come with that, the celebration that comes with that, but who owns space, who makes these decisions. Another example too that I often highlight, at least to people up here, is Nashville's Public Square, a really great public space, a place that I've got a lot of great memories to. But for those who know the history, was also a slave auction block. And I think for me that was kind of one of the light switch moments of conflicting these images to Live on the Green, which again, an excellent event that I really love, on the exact same space that that slaves, people, human beings were bought and sold, right? And these two histories and meanings happened in a simultaneous area. And this gets back to, and I think what John and Dr. Woods mentioned too, of the purposefulness of this, but also how policy and plays into this as well too. And so I think that's kind of what I've been wrestling with these past several years that now I've been in the planning profession, is how do I reconcile my professional history of perpetuating inequity? Right, and then kind of the role of that. So trying to not get too heady too fast out the gate, John. Sorry, I'll kind of roll it back a step here, but I think for me that kind of orients what I do is a lot of the history that Dr. Woods alluded to, and specifically as for planners and urban designers, is how does that land use policy, the zoning codes that communities have too, which again, those who kind of track history, early 1900s originated in different communities and were really kind of codified and solidified in the 1920s. And zoning code, which is again the policies and rules that guide how land is used, early on were a legally defensible way to segregate people, kind of through kind of the lens of and literally the wording is the right type of building or the wrong type of building, and by extension, who uses those buildings. And so that was, again, the legally defensible way to kind of keep people separated. And well, those people here, and we'll keep the good people here. And multiple kind of iterations and refinements of that, as Dr. Woods alluded to. One I'll kind of highlight too that's gotten some attention up here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota more recently is the idea of racially restrictive covenants, which is language that, again, to Dr. Woods' points, explicitly lists. And I'm actually going to read out an example for one of them, kind of who you can or cannot sell homes to. So this is, and I'm reading from an image I'm looking at on my screen, and the couple sentences here goes, the party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises, or the home, hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, Semitic, or African blood or descent, and then goes on to say how it can't be even passed on future to those groups as well too. And what's wild, again, why I think for up here it maintained a lot of attention, is there was a project that mapped where those covenants still exist to this day. Thankfully, no one's adhering, enforcing them per se, but there are dozens and if not more homes across the Twin Cities, and specifically in Minneapolis and the historically, white neighborhoods, where there's still covenants that say you legally cannot sell to certain types of people. And so again, that idea of stepping into this history as planners and land use policy that guides this work. More recently, we've had kind of, I'll call them wins of civil rights, fair housing, things that have tried to kind of right the ship, if I can use that phrase. But in the same time, land use policy finds ways. Prejudice finds a way, right? Kind of the inverse of the Jurassic Park phrase, life finds a way. And prejudice tends to find a way as well too. So kind of more common day things such as exclusionary zoning, which is a practice that essentially separates land uses by type and oftentimes single kind of land uses of this can only be a commercial use or only a residential use, and we're separating where they can and cannot be located. Another one that always kind of strikes me is things such as large lot sizes, saying we are going to mandate that in this kind of zoning district, you have to have a lot of a certain size, and usually larger sizes, which oftentimes and usually present cost barriers to certain socioeconomic groups, and of course historically BIPOC people as well too. Things, I'm a proponent to some degree of design standards, and Gary knows, working in the design center, a high quality design has a lot of benefits. The flip side of that coin is things such as, overly restrictive design guidelines. Again, it presents a cost barrier at times to a project, raising the, rents and mortgage costs, things of that nature too. And I think kind of more today, these are these things that, at least for my firm up here, again, Bolton and Mink up in the Twin Cities, we're a consulting firm. And we work, I should have said, about 99% of our clients are public clients, so city, county, states up here in Minnesota and surrounding areas. And so we kind of really are trying to be in the weeds and work with communities up here around these issues. And it's things of that nature that kind of get me excited of how can, the policy side of things, how can that be identified, understood, and called out, and then reworked in order to be more inclusive, which I know we'll probably talk about solutions and opportunities in the near future. But I think it kind of, as Dr. Woods teed up, understanding what the issue is, or the history of the stuff, to me at least, is really important. And then an immense amount of opportunity, I think, which is facing all of us, especially those in the planning and design profession, which I'm sure we'll jump into in a minute. So appreciate again being here and looking forward to today's conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mike. All right, and Gary, tell us a little bit about the work you're doing at the Civic Design Center in Nashville.
Great. Thank you, John. It's good to see everybody on here. I appreciate the invitation to come speak. The Civic Design Center was founded in 2000, and I just want to touch on a few projects, major projects that we've worked on throughout the past 20 years that I think go in to depth about land use and planning. And if anybody was interested in reading more about that, that might be a good somewhat local or regional versions that people can read more about on these topics. Because I mean, I went to architecture school. I know we didn't really study a lot about planning history when I studied architecture. And so I think that's probably the case for most Americans, is they don't know the history of a lot of these planning practices in housing and transportation that have so negatively impacted so many people across the country. And our goal is to, as many ways as we can here locally, is to try to start to work with the city and neighborhood organizations and other nonprofits to try to rectify a lot of those negative practices that have happened. Very early on in the 2000s, 2001, we started a project called the Plan of Nashville, and it focused on our urban core of the city. And there's a really good, that's a book that's available on Amazon if you're interested, or at the library, but it actually has a really well-written history about how Nashville was an example of all those planning practices that happened from the federal level down and from a local level up. So if you wanted to read more about how that actually, all those planning practices came to fruition in a city, I would recommend the history section of that. That was a really great planning practice because it was a grassroots process that engaged community members in establishing a vision for what they would like to see happen in their neighborhoods. And it went into the face of many decades of planning practice, or even centuries, I guess, where it was a very top-down hierarchical approach to planning practice. And so that was really exciting. I think it was a really big transition point in Nashville for doing something known as participatory planning. And a lot of that was focused on the topic of land use, how we wanted to see our cities and the land change from these practices that had pushed out people away from the urban core through white flight, had decentralized investment in our urban centers, and had essentially left this ring of poverty in the cities that were not invested in for so many years. The next project that I wanted to touch on is About in the I would say 2010, we started working on a regional study of land use and transportation planning, where we took two topics that had been completely separated at a federal level, how we deal with land use and housing and how we deal with transportation, and actually started to bring them together and say, you really can't do one without the other. They need to be thought of together. And through that approach, we think that's going to be a better planning practice. That looked at how we can rethink, how do we incorporate different types of transit, not just focused on the single occupancy vehicle, the car, but let's think about public transit, let's think about trains, let's think about people on bikes, and let's think about pedestrians in that process, and how do we begin to plan differently. And I think that was where we began to really also fold in equity as a part of that process, because not everybody uses a car or wants to use a car every day. Not everybody has access to a car. So equity is inherent to a planning process if you don't just assume that you're planning around an automobile. And that also expanded our work outside of just the urban core of Nashville to a regional planning scope. That's where we began working with TDOT and with other agencies that have more of a statewide approach rather than just here in Nashville. And we began planning on a scale that took us outside of just thinking about one place. Even though our case study city was Nashville in the region, we approached it in a way that was applicable to any city across the state. And that was the way that TDOT wanted us to think through those, is that Knoxville, Chattanooga, Memphis, other major urban areas in Tennessee could use this as an example and approach that to planning within their own communities. In the 2013, 2014, we were working on public health. We worked very closely with the state of Tennessee Public Health Department, with our local public health department here in Nashville, to do a project called Shaping the Healthy Community. And I actually have this is a publication that was produced through that process. John, if anybody across the state wants one of these books, I will be happy to provide you with as many as you need. But again, that was where we began thinking explicitly about public health and planning, two professions that had been very focused and working together during the 1800s and early 1900s to solve health problems that were related to infrastructure and diseases that were caused by poor sanitation or cleanliness. And then those professions really veered apart following World War II. And I think it's actually really interesting if you look at what Dr. Woods was talking about with all the planning decisions and the policy level federal decisions that were made. If you parallel those with how public health and planning really parted ways, you see just a dramatic rise in public health issues that I think that there's a really deep story there in trying to connect more and looking back at how all those things were actually in many ways closely related to each other. And then through this process, we also we worked with different community types. So rural, we understand that planning is very different in a rural community than it is in downtown Nashville. And a suburban neighborhood or suburban designed place is very different than an urban neighborhood in a downtown context. So each chapter of this book is broken out based on a community type. And again, no matter where you are across the country, you can classify community types based on those general forms of communities. And then the last thing I want to touch on is what we've been focused on really intently over the last couple years at the Design Center is the explicit conversation about equity and socially conscious design practices. And that is acknowledging that, planning and design has a long history outside of the federal stuff that we've talked about. The professions of planning and design also have a history of exclusionary practice and not being diverse in the professions. And also because of that non-diversity, I think there's been a implicit racist processes that have gone along with that. And so we understood here that the only way to really try to rectify that is to try to build more diversity in the professions, because and to let youth locally here and maybe across the state or all across the country know that they have a voice in the planning processes that happen in their neighborhoods. And if they realize that, I think it can be really engaging for them. It can be exciting. And that excitement can then build into being more informed, engaged in your community, in your city, in your country. And that the long-term impact of that is that we will see more diversity in, hopefully in all types of professions that are related to anything associated with land use and planning and development and design. We incorporated, I'll just switch here to the website so I can see all of these, but we incorporated 7 principles of socially conscious design into everything that we tried to do. We use those as a lens through all the projects that we do here in Nashville and our work in the region and across the country. We want all of our work to try to promote inclusivity in the process, amplify voices that have historically been excluded from planning conversations or design, identify overlooked problems that, again, we can go back to and see, and then how can we work to help solve those problems with community members in the city, increase just awareness broadly, build support for these projects to try to make sure that they are implemented with the overall goal of just trying to build and create equity. And then the outcome of all of these is a part of our mission statement, which is to raise quality of life for all. And our official mission statement is to advocate for civic design visions and actionable change in communities to improve quality of life for all. So that's just a quick snapshot of our work in the realm of land use and equity.
Great, thanks so much, Gary. Matt, do we have any questions yet from our audience?
We do. First question, when spaces have been officially separated from our past, how effective is it to unofficially try to open up that space?
Yeah, interesting question, and I think kind of Gary, maybe some like the tactical urbanism stuff too might come into play with this. And I think I'd want to know a little bit more kind of the definition of unofficially, but I think in terms of kind of how do you rectify the official kind of segregation or separation of space? I mean, because it's being a planner, it's one of the first places you look is what is land use policy, what does the zoning codes of that community say, and then looking for opportunities to formally mixed use zoning districts where you can actually formally integrate uses that have historically been segregated is kind of the more formal approach. But in terms of kind of informal, I mean, looking for opportunities to bring people together and kind of an idea of a demonstration project or a pop-up event and kind of showing alternative uses or supportive uses that could occur within a place to kind of be a primer to these conversations, especially when there's hesitancy around, well, this has always been just this. I can't even envision what else this could be. I think doing kind of, events and community-led support and building that, and of course, doing equitable engagement throughout the entire process of saying, hey, let's dream together about what this could be and find kind of ways to demonstrate that, and even at a kind of a low-cost temporary means is a way to build support towards more long-term permanent changes on a policy level.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think that because of the historic disinvestment in places that, there are a lot of opportunities we have a project called Reclaiming Public Space, which is looking at either disinvested public spaces like in cities so that we're ensuring that there's an equal investment or, a diversified investment in public spaces. One's not really beautiful in the city and one's like truly not upkept or not invested in, but also infrastructure, just leftover infrastructure that's just not used at all, or it's like, why is this here? You know, or it's a giant piece of asphalt that where a road came together, but it's an opportunity for maybe a new neighborhood center in a place. And I think when community members identify places like that, but they maybe don't, historically, there was no way to even think about that space differently. It's just always been that way. Having them really understand that there are processes to go back into and try to turn that into something that they, and what is it about it that they would like to see there reflected in the neighborhood's community or the history of the place. One thing I want to just make sure we do recognize is that those actions can sometimes have unintended consequences. I mean, you know, I think especially Nashville is a good example of a really fast growing city that's changed a lot in the last decade. I mean, it's like daily changing. You know, I drove around West End Avenue, a major street here that I hadn't been on in like 2 or 3 weeks. And there's like a new building that's over there that I hadn't seen before. And with the rapid redevelopment of our urban, and just all over the city, not just urban areas, but particularly urban areas, you're seeing a lot of people being displaced because of the rapidly rising costs. And sometimes you just have to be very conscious of doing a project purposefully with a community and then trying to work on a city level as much as possible and locally within the neighborhood to ensure that there are protections in place as much as possible to maintain the community as intact, and not try to actually, through doing something that you think is helping improve the quality of the community, you're actually furthering the displacements that's happening. And, you know, I think from planners and designers and creative types, that's a little bit of an area that we really have only been thinking about recently, because we tend to be more on like the super creative side, and it's like, okay, let's just go in and do this, and not thinking about that your actions can really have an unintended consequence that's negative for people. So I think to me, that's like where the socially conscious design principles really became a major part of our work, was to always think about that up front in everything you do, so that you're not, you know, you're not being a negative force.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges too, I think you guys raised great points. One of the struggles is that, you know, when you think about gentrification and some of the issues around development, it's kind of reminiscent of urban renewal back in the 60s. And, you know, James Baldwin famously referred to urban renewal as Negro removal. And gentrification in many ways is like that too, right? Because you know, you don't have to, in the 21st century, you don't have to have the explicit language, you know, Mike, that you referenced earlier, in the restrictive covenant. You just have to raise the prices to a point where the gaps in wealth around race and ethnic gaps just price people out, frankly. And as an aside, I'd love that restrictive covenant. That I'd like to use it in class. And Gary, I want that book too. But I'm being silly a little bit, but not really. But I think your points are really well taken. And I think part of the challenges that we have today is to at least acknowledge the fact that the federal government stigmatized people of color and defined them as adverse influences on a whole host of good housing, right? And then on top of that, once you have this kind of generational divestment in communities, then you have in the 1950s and 60s, you know, interstate highways running through and bisecting communities, like in Nashville over on Jefferson Street. But that you know, I-40 experience happened all over the country, right? And so where you look at where you know, interstates went through highways, through cities in the 50s and 60s, oftentimes they essentially just bisected Black communities completely. And so the struggle has been real, it's been generational, and I think it will take a similar level of intentionality to kind of start changing or moving the needle in a different way for more equity.
If I can actually follow that up real quick, the generational nature, and I'm going to diverge a little bit from the question, I apologize, but I think that generational impact of these decisions, that's something that, at our firm, we're trying to always learn better, but also kind of then communicate externally of, I'll take housing, which a few of us were talking before the roundtable started, and in Minnesota a couple weeks back, or a couple months back rather. Kind of an annual report of home ownership and sales and that kind of stuff came out, but really the headline was how home ownership amongst kind of people groups has broadened, is kind of BIPOC communities basically have increasingly lower home ownership rates than especially white households. And the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, again a federal agency, they were very explicit. I mean, the headline of their article, which I'm looking at here, is "Systemic Racism Haunts Home Ownership Rates in Minnesota." And again, this is the Federal Reserve saying this. This isn't, some advocacy group. And they go through a series of charts and examples about how, the two punchlines I'll kind of share from that is that home ownership rates, again, kind of by people group, white home ownership rate is about 80% in Minnesota. For Black community, for Black populations, it's about 25%. And just think about that, almost 80% to 25%. And again, this article, the kind of their report traces through much of what Dr. Gary were mentioning about how when you've got generational exclusion from access and especially capital, the ripple effects that has, and the greater, I don't know if susceptibility is the right phrase, but the greater risk of things such as, gentrification, displacement because of that, access to capital for home loans and things of that nature. And I just wanted to pause there and really emphasize that this isn't just it used to happen, and so we're good though now, but it really is the ramifications of that are embedded within our social and economic systems, and we're trying to reconcile with examples or instances of the here and now, but that are traced back hundreds of years at times.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And we were chatting just before our webinar started today about that persistence of the impacts of these policies. We were talking a little bit about the Mapping Inequality Project, which is it's a project where some academics have digitized redlining maps for cities across the country. And several of the cities are here in Tennessee, and you can actually see which areas were considered to be okay to insure and which ones weren't for housing. And one of the academics who created those maps said, this is basically a Rosetta Stone for cities. This is kind of the secret code of why things are the way they are. And he said you can go to any city, whether you've been there before or not, and you can walk around and look around, and you can pretty much guess if that area was redlined or not. And that's how powerful it was. These policies are not around anymore, but we're still living with the legacy of them. And so, I would love to shift our conversation a little bit now to, what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about to address this legacy that's all around us, really. And I would love to maybe ask Mike. You're talking about being an urban planner in Minneapolis. You're working in the private sector. Is equity something that you guys are thinking about in your work, and what does that look like for you?
Yeah, literally every day, all the time. And I think part of I mentioned kind of the murder of George Floyd at the kickoff of that. That's been truly is kind of a reckoning, a cultural reckoning up here. That has permeated across really the Twin Cities metro and has been long overdue, of course. I think pretty much everyone in our profession will say that. But as among the many outcomes of that has been this, city level, county level, even kind of our MPO up here, the Metropolitan Council, all of them now have very much, integrated specific and explicit considerations and measures around equity in the entirety of the process, from how requests for proposals are put out, the identification of projects, funding applications, funding applications, I mean, we could talk all day about even just those and shifts and exclusion and inclusion around that. When consultants in particular, again, I'm coming from the private perspective now, when we propose on a project, DBE and other requirements too, to try to increase equitable participation and even bidding and project pursuits and things of that nature. But really the biggest one, I was on a conversation with some people yesterday is around that engagement, which I know Gary touched on quite a bit too. Of there's a very heavy expectation, and I mean that in a positive way, heavy expectation around equitable engagement, thinking outside of the box, and really collaborative, participatory design and planning efforts, shifting it from, speaking as a white male dominated profession, to truly more of a community collaborative approach to identifying issues and opportunities, solutions, becoming active participants within the rethinking of land use, transportation, et cetera. So without going too far into it, because again, we could talk about that all day, but I think, for a lot of reasons, specifically I mentioned George Floyd and the reckoning around that, at least up here that I can speak to, I mean, it is becoming an ever more cornerstone expectation around the planning and design processes.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. So yeah, a big focus on engaging communities and seeing communities as experts and engaging them in the decision making about their cities. Gary, I wanted to ask you, so when we think about where we want to go, we know what the legacy is, we know where we are. When we're thinking about equitable design, what does that look like? Can you paint a picture for us of if a city was designed in an equitable way, what would that look like, and how do we get there?
Well, Dr. Woods mentioned the interstate construction, and specifically where that happens in Nashville very prominently is along Jefferson Street, which is our most historic Black community, African-American neighborhood that was extraordinarily vibrant before the construction of the interstate. And, there was a whole history of, that neighborhood being, the interstate was built there directly through the community, bisected it, made former neighbors that couldn't even really get to each other. And that happened in cities all across the country. What I find exciting is that actually in the Plan of Nashville process almost 20 years ago, all of our neighborhood meetings in North Nashville talked about the impacts of the interstate. It is a lasting scar in the community. People talk about what it was like before that, and their vision was that the interstate would go away or that it would be radically transformed. And so when we created the Plan of Nashville, that was the recommendation in the plan. And because we weren't really coming up with the vision. The vision was given to us by the communities where we engaged with, and it was our responsibility to reflect that in the designs that we presented. And so if you go and you look at that book, it called for removing segments of interstates in the neighborhoods where they were most negative, or some form of capping over it, putting a park on top, providing new access points so that neighborhoods were reconnected that were divided. And while that was about 15 years ago in the planning timeline, that's not really a long amount of time. And it's actually moving towards something being done about that. And there's been proposals to look at, taking that idea from just a vision to how would it actually work. What was the engineering that would be required from that? Our city MPO is currently modeling removal segments of interstate in our inner loop and bridging over and creating new parks on top of segments along the Jefferson Street interstate, which could reconnect streets that have been dead ends for 50 or 60 years. That is also, funding is now being proposed at the federal level that would fund these types of projects. They're very expensive to go back, but as the infrastructure of our country is being funded and repaired because it's reaching its end of life, then through these community conversations, we can begin to plan things differently that try to go back and rectify mistakes and practices from the past. So to me, that's like an equitable form of design, is where you show up, you engage with people, you listen to them, you incorporate that into the planning, and then you work every single day to try to make it happen.
That's great. Thanks, Gary. Matt, do we have any more questions from our audience?
Yes, we have several. Are there efforts that include the equity of people with disabilities?
Yeah, great question, and I appreciate too that kind of, the equity encompasses many people as it should, and remembering, kind of the entirety of what that word means is important too. It's kind of American with Disabilities Act, I think, is kind of the foundation that at least kind of private consulting world and kind of planners and even especially engineers, that's really what many lean to is, what does ADA require, full stop, for better or worse. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to further reinforce and revisit those guidelines and expectations. But I think in terms of, access, mobility in particular, ADA is going to be the guidance that's there, kind of because that's just what is there. At the federal level, it's at ADA and it goes. But I think there absolutely should always be, and I think this is where really the design world has started to show some interesting promise around design solutions that can further open up land use and mobility opportunities to be more welcoming and encompassing of those of all ages and abilities. And consideration for the most vulnerable. And I think that's a term that especially transportation planners use often, is the most vulnerable user. And oftentimes in transportation decisions, it's, those who walk or roll, use a wheelchair or mobility devices of types. And I think for cities and communities, I mean, that's an opportunity that has for past several years now is really kind of, many communities have started to leverage that of, complete streets policies or just formal policies that do say in mobility and transportation decisions, these are the groups that should be prioritized first, as Gary was referencing, before even personal vehicles and things of that nature too. So that's kind of some early stages and some kind of initial thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, we've just looked at the way our current infrastructure. I have a lot of photos from this Healthy Communities book where it was just infrastructure that was like, a light pole would be right in the middle of the sidewalk, and there's just no way that anybody could get around that. Or just all kinds of connectivity issues. Like, how do you, you may have transit to a certain point, but then you get off the bus and there's no way that you could connect to it, or there's a bus bench sitting on a ditch next to a road. Is just, how do you start to link and connect everything that's accessible to people? And then other design aspects in maybe in buildings, individual building design that recognizes different users. That's just designed and built in a universal design way, so that people with all kinds of means or needs have accessibility to that.
Right. Great, thanks. Matt, do we have any more questions from our audience? Oh, Matt, you're muted.
Thanks, John. Do you have any thoughts on how to address these issues in a state where it can be hard to have conversations and make plans that require people to acknowledge the role of white privilege and systemic racism? It's hard to advocate for equitable design if some don't recognize an equitable legacy of the current design. How can we better frame this, particularly outside of Nashville?
Do you have any easier questions, Matt? No, what a really excellent question. Does anybody want to take that one on?
Well, I'll just say something. I think what we've seen somewhat in the Middle Tennessee region is an approach to regionalism where, Nashville used to be, I think the historic approach was, you've got Nashville and then you've got the surrounding counties, but there wasn't a lot of communication or agreement in the planning practices. And so everybody just kind of operated independently. And I think what's happened is that through a coalition building process of the counties beginning to communicate with each other, it started with all the mayors in those counties working together. And that's a very diverse politically region, right? We have a more blue Nashville, and then, various different aspects of all around us. But that they all just knew that working together was better than just each one working independently. So I think that that's been a promising advancement in the last maybe 15 to 10 years in Nashville and Middle Tennessee is that through working as a block collectively, we can have a more substantial influence at the state level when we go to ask for things that are related to planning. That doesn't necessarily get explicitly into the question about the past racially, but I think that that's maybe an approach that could be beneficial to use in the future. It is really difficult though.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Woods, I saw you unmute if you want to go first, and then I can follow.
I'm trying to mute. Am I muted?
No, you're on mute now. Oh, now you're remuted. Sorry.
Oh.
Okay, sorry. I saw the mute, and then anyway, I'm better with Zoom than I am with Teams. Just full disclosure. But what I was going to say was that I think one of the struggles is that, you know, to address systemic issues is that you can go K through PhD in our educational system and really not learn in any great detail about institutional and systemic issues around structural inequity or structural racism, right? And so part of the struggle I think happens is that, you know, if it's not in the curriculum, you know, and you can go, you can take classes in college that address these issues, but you don't have to, right? And as we have a legislature that's increasingly, you know, not just in Tennessee, but just across the country, taking positions against having conversations about systemic issues around race, right? With you know, bills against critical race theory. I think having conversations that acknowledge systems and structures and policies and institutions is the first step to at least historically even addressing these issues. Because if you're not exposed to them, it's like they never existed. And I think that's part of the struggle. You know, sometimes it's like, I guess one of the analogies I use for trying to think about systemic issues around race or any other structural and institutional practices. You know, if you've ever gone to Los Angeles and walked around, you don't see the smog, but when you come back and take a panoramic view, you're like, damn, I was breathing what, right? I mean, and so I think in a whole lot of ways, these issues are difficult because they often are invisible for people until they're forced to confront them. And in our society, you can go a lifetime, frankly, without ever really confronting these issues. And so I don't think, you know, James Baldwin once said, not every problem that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced, right? And so I think that's part of the struggle is we've got to at least address this painful history, at least acknowledge that it existed before we can even start to think about making broader, better, more effective change.
Mm-hmm. I'm in, first of all, full agreements with what was just both said by these two, and I'm still conflicted to this date with what I'm about to say, because I think I don't quite know how to navigate this piece of it, but while bringing people along with an education understanding of equity, inequity, et cetera, you know, there's been a lot of success stories out there about how do you address these things without actually talking about them. And again, that's where I get a little conflicted, because I think eventually you do need to talk about them. But John and Matt, I think, you know, with some work at the Department of Health, the idea of livability, right? Like, we're not necessarily, you know, opportunities that kind of cast as livability rather than, you know, maybe more complex ideas. Well, who doesn't want to live in a livable community, right? And finding that commonality and common narratives. And when it comes to equity and land use in particular, you know, one thing that we address and try to bring up oftentimes is how, you know, an increase in inequity, so the more inequitable things are, as a result, there's just a strain on local municipal systems, right? I'm thinking, especially in the public city lens, think of transportation and road degradation, use of you know, utilities and things of that nature, economy and taxes, healthcare, right? Like, when you have an unhealthy population because of land use decisions, that's a strain and a burden on the local healthcare system. So, you know, trying to say, okay, well, we'll get to the equity piece, and that will be discussed, but What about the economics? What about the financial viability of the city? What about, positive tax changes and growth that can occur when these things are done? One thing that, we started to do in a community just north of Minneapolis. It's the most diverse community in Minnesota, which may not be saying that much. We're pretty white up here, but it's a majority community. And we looked at, as we're kind of doing some work in that community, what's the per capita community tax burden compared to other communities? So as you household, how much of the local tax here are you paying compared to other communities? And it's crazy how you see some of these lower disinvested communities and their tax burden per capita is significantly higher than more wealthy communities. And I bring that not to get too technical necessarily here, but kind of as an example of there are narratives and kind of conversations that can happen around rebalancing even tax burden, things of that nature, economic opportunities and the strengths and benefits that come from that. And what are the threads that you can pull on to connect and rally people while simultaneously bringing this education piece, alongside it.
Great, thank you all. Those are excellent responses to a really tough question. We only have 4 minutes left. Matt, do we have another question that we can get to in our last few minutes?
Sure. This will be a little bit of a different topic, but can you speak to land use regarding urban agriculture and how inner city communities can gain access and maintain lands for food production with urban zoning codes? Currently, urban farmers are competing for access to vacant lands with emerging housing developers.
Yeah, great question. I think some that many communities across the country are navigating, and I'll try to keep this answer short. I would say, as a starting place, the community I just referenced, this exact same circumstance, we're navigating with them too, of several groups, especially BIPOC urban agriculture groups, are looking for opportunities to grow urban food production. And so working with, the city, I think like Parks and Rec Board, or kind of looking for city-owned land and maybe starting with there rather than private land. But what are there city-owned land or lots that could be partnered with towards urban ag, and maybe do a pilot project for a season around, will the city, the Public Works Department, Parks and Rec provide, water access, things of that nature, and then kind of have some supportive, groups who can kind of pursue urban ag policies in relation to that too. And, finding vacant land, of course, in urban areas is tough, especially with land values. And so that's why, finding success potentially around what are already city-owned or publicly owned lots that could be utilized and kind of build from there.
Great, thanks, Mike. We have a couple of minutes left. Any final thoughts from anyone? I think maybe a nice way to close this out is maybe some words of wisdom and hope. Maybe just a minute or so from each of you. Something that you'd like everyone to take away, as they're going back to their workplaces and thinking about how they might be able to do something to engage in land use, and thinking about that as a solution for dealing with some of the equity issues that are so persistent. Maybe just a few words of wisdom from each of you. Maybe Lewis, Dr. Woods, we'll start with you.
Okay, so you hear me? Good. Okay, just making sure, triple checking. One of the things I would say is that none of us created these structures or systems, right? But we inherited them. And now that we have become more aware of them, I think it's important and imperative to just remember that I think generationally, we owe a debt to elders and ancestors, but we also owe a debt to future unborn generations as well. And none of this stuff happens overnight, but anything that's done positively today can change the trajectory for future generations. So I would just encourage folks to think about it generationally as a motivation and as an obligation to do something, make this a little more equitable, a little bit better.
All right, thanks. Mike, you want to go next?
Yeah, and kind of a similar vein as well too. I think an awareness of the immediacy of opportunities with an understanding of the longevity of kind of what we're talking about, both of kind of how we got to where we are, but also too, I mean, it's not going to be tomorrow we wake up and we got, you know, equity and land use in perfect synchronicity, if that's even a word. So I think kind of, you know, a balanced and patient persistence. How about that? I'll kind of close on patient persistence.
All right, and Gary. Oh, Gary, you're muted.
Sorry, I've a friend of mine has told me I'm the most consistently optimistic person that he's ever met. So I think you know, what I've learned over the last couple of years is just I think in our personal lives we can probably become part of a bubble that we feel comfortable in, and maybe we don't get out of very much. But certainly the last year or more has shown that the importance of getting out and engaging others that's outside of your immediate sphere on a personal or a professional level is so critical to better understand people, whether that's people that agree with you or completely opposite agreement with you. It's hard sometimes, very difficult, but I think you find something more personal in dealing directly with someone, that you can find a commonality there. And then I think from a professional level, it's really critical to understand the past and to be knowledgeable about that, and then to understand what your role is moving forward into the future. And I think, you know, even how you can serve, whatever that personal experience is for you, understanding how you can be an ally to making things better that try to, you know, to correct past actions. And that's where I personally have fallen into current state of things.
All right, great. Thanks, Gary. Well, I just wanted to say thank you again to each of our panelists. Thanks for sharing your expertise, your wisdom, your words of hope and optimism. This has been an excellent discussion. I wish it was a little bit longer today. I feel like we could keep talking, but thanks for the time that you shared with us today. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you at the next installment of our Health Equity series. So we'll make this available on our website, and hope to see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, thanks.